Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. Today we have a selection of passages from Ezekiel and Jeremiah. And a key thought for today is that we often look to the Bible for reassurance, but not necessarily accountability. The Bible offers reassurance, but not always in the way that we want to hear it. In today's reading, the people of Israel hunger for peace, but Ezekiel and Jeremiah do not give the people what they want. Jeremiah is even opposed by a rival prophet, Hananiah, who then gives the people the prophecy that they want to hear. In the New Testament, Paul calls these false prophets and preachers ear ticklers, 2 Timothy 4:2. So as we proceed in our today's reading, what is the historical backdrop and what's going on? At about 594 BCE, there appears to have been attempted an insurrection in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had to quell this rebellion, and this resulted in the killing off of many of his own troops and officials. Around this time, after this, around 594 to 593, Nebuchadnezzar then returns to the west and continues a military campaign in Syria. And it appears that the kingdom of Judah sought to exploit this internal strife taking place in Babylon. And so this apparent weakness in Nebuchadnezzar's rule gives the opportunity for him to join a coalition of nations to oppose Babylon and free themselves from Babylonian dominion. So that's kind of what's going on, is that Israel feels like this might be the time to shake off the shackles of Babylon. So we have a series of prophecies and illustrations from both Jeremiah and Ezekiel here. So beginning with chapter 3, we have this idea of the watchman. Ezekiel is appointed as a watchman. And we've previously noted the broad applicability of the calling of Jeremiah and Isaiah to believers kind of in general, but also noted that these are specifically call narratives for these prophets. They function foremost as a divine confirmation that they carry on in their prophetic ministry, God is with them. They can have confidence in obeying God regardless of what happens to them, because God is sovereign over all things. And this is especially important for Jeremiah and Ezekiel because they're going to suffer in their ministries. They're going to be there for the Babylonian conquest. Ezekiel is appointed as a watchman over Israel, and the status of his divine commission is immediately confirmed by the next section, which is a vision that he has in the valley. And he explicitly says that he has again seen the same vision that we saw in chapter 1. So in a general sense, there's this profound burden placed on those who are commissioned to preach the gospel, not only to do as commanded by God, but to remain faithful to that gospel message. And that's kind of what's being communicated through these called narratives. Next, Ezekiel ties himself up with ropes, and this is clearly pointing to the captivity of the people of Israel when Babylon comes to conquer. But there's also another layer here. If we recall in an earlier reading of Jeremiah, he was forbidden from interceding for the people on behalf of the people. And here Ezekiel is also forbidden from speaking except what God specifically gives him to say. And so the prophet is being prohibited from pleading with God for leniency in God's judgments. Next, Ezekiel builds a model of Jerusalem, and he plays army by attacking it. And this is more than just a prophecy of Babylon's attack against Jerusalem, but God himself is part of this siege. The kings of Jerusalem and Babylon still have like this old ancient Near Eastern way of thinking about their gods, where they think of the defeat of a nation as the defeat of that nation's gods. Israel's God is God over all the earth, not just Jerusalem, and he is not defeated if Jerusalem is defeated. In a twist, the king of Jerusalem thinks that, God will protect the city from Babylon, but Ezekiel is saying that it is God who controls Babylon, and it is God himself, using Babylon, who is attacking Jerusalem. Ezekiel next is prophesying for 40 days on his right side and for 390 days on his left side. And I couldn't find any clear deciphering of what these numbers, exact number combination, indicated. But the commentators in general agree that what is clear is that God's judgment is thoughtful and measured and proportionate. The northern nation of Israel is still an object of God's concern, and Ezekiel's sign act here kind of implies their eventual restoration. Next, we have Ezekiel's bread recipe, which you can find in the store, even to this day. Many possible interpretations for this. First, the unique recipe may represent a scarcity of preferred ingredients. While in exile, the people will be forced to make do with whatever it is that they can find. Some commentators go so far as to say that this is implying that there's a famine that's going to take place. And so Ezekiel illustrates this through this bread recipe. Cooking over dung implies contamination, that people will be forced to live in a ritually unclean environment. And exile isn't just living away from the land of Israel and its temple, but away from the rituals and communities that define the people as God's people. Next, we cut on over to Jeremiah, where Jeremiah wears a yoke across his shoulders. And first he prophesies to the ambassadors from the cities of, or the nations of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. Next, he prophesies directly to the king Zedekiah, king of Jerusalem, and then he prophesies to the other prophets. And after he does all this prophecy, he's opposed by one of the prophets. Hananiah opposes him. He tears off the yoke that Jeremiah is wearing, and he says that there's going to be peace. There's going to be peace in the future, and that Jerusalem is going to tear off the yoke that Babylon has placed on it. Jeremiah rebukes Hananiah, and then Jeremiah and the Lord kind of respond to all of this. And the chapter kind of verse 17 ends with the death of Hananiah for having defied God. So what is Hananiah's sin? What's wrong with his prophecy? What's really taking place? The Jeremiah section begins with a prophecy, as we said, to the ambassadors of neighboring nations that appear to be there to form this coalition against Babylon. The sin of the kingdom of Judah is twofold. First, it's a refusal to accept God's divine proclamation of judgment. God has ordained Babylon to carry out God's will, and the nation is opposing God's own decree. Secondly, though, rather than trusting God, the nation of Israel has formed a coalition, and they are, in essence, relying on the strength of their alliances rather than on the faithfulness of God. And keep in mind that a nation's strength was representative of the powers of their gods. And so a coalition in which God's people rely on foreign nations for their protection is effectively placing their trust in the foreign gods of other nations. Hananiah's false prophecy is politically in support of the king and the policies of the kingship, and of course supporting the alliances with these neighboring countries. This warning against alliances, we see this throughout the Bible, kind of like beginning in Joshua and carrying all the way through. We see explicit prohibitions in Isaiah 30, 31, and then again in chapters 36 through 39. But it's more than that. It's a warning against trusting anything other than God. Jerusalem's walls cannot save them. The temple is not a guarantee of divine favor. Egypt and the surrounding nations cannot replace God. Nothing can overturn God's judgment. And above all, no matter how bad it may seem, this chapter just kind of ends with a statement that Babylon will not endure forever. And so our reading today actually ends with exactly that, this oracle of a scroll being tied to a rock and tossed into the water. And it says, just as this goes plummeting into the Euphrates River, so will Babylon fall. In Revelation 18:21, there's a direct allusion to this passage in Jeremiah, as at the end of time, an angel tosses a millstone into the ocean and says, and thus will Babylon fall. And so there's a sense in which this prophecy isn't just talking about Babylon, it's talking about the whole world system, which the Bible frequently refers to as Babylon writ large. And that it's a reminder to us that we are God's people. We are not part of Babylon. And one of these days we'll be freed from the yoke of bondage to it.